Welcome to God Talk from your chaplaincy team at CCCU. This week we are pleased to welcome Jane Joyce. Jane is a bereavement counsellor with Cruse Bereavement UK, is a graduate from Canterbury Christ Church University and is currently studying an MRes, Aids to Communication in Grief and Loss with individuals who have speech or language impairments. So this afternoon we're welcoming Jane. So tell us a bit about yourself, Jane.
Okay, I'm Jane. I've been a bereavement volunteer for Cruse for 4 years. Well, I've been working for Cruse in general for 4 years. I've been a bereavement volunteer with them for 3 years, but for the past 4 years, I've also been an admin assistant, which means that I get to work in the office, dealing with helping with the phone calls, the initial phone calls that we receive for the people, and then process them for the waiting list. I'm also a ordinary generic counsellor, which means that I'm an ordinary counsellor as well, but I just specialised. I've just not long completed my undergrad at Canterbury at CCU, and that was in BA Honours, Counselling, Coaching and Mentoring. And I've just literally, for the past month or so, began my MRes in education. So in where I'm looking at aids to communication in grief and loss with individuals with communication difficulties. So that's where I am.
So obviously quite a lot and quite heavily involved in therapy, one way or another, counselling, coaching and mentoring. I'm really interested in the title because you say Cruse with God. What do you mean by cruise? Because when you talk about cruising, I think of being on Miami Boulevard in big American cars and cruising up and down and enjoying the sun, but I guess you probably don't mean that.
No, and the interesting bit that you may realise is Cruse that way, so that we've got an eye in, apparently. No, so basically Cruse goes that in 1959 Margaret Towie, she formed a group for widowers, and they were called let me get this right because I never get this right. They were called the Cruse Club Counselling Services for Widows and Their Families. I'm glad they shortened it. And basically she formed this group in 1959, and since then we've just grown, and we're now one of the leading bereavement services that provides bereavement support for individuals, whether it's children, adults, young people who are bereaved. So so we offer it in various ways. Prior to lockdown, we were doing face-to-face, but because of COVID restrictions, we're now having to offer telephone support services, email support services, but via the website you can do an instant chat messenger service, so for those that need it.
So in this COVID season that we're living in, Cruse becomes a particularly important charity and does really important work. But I should imagine lockdown 1 had a tremendous effect on the work you could do. Perhaps you could explain how lockdown 1 affected you personally in terms of work, not your personal experience of lockdown so much, but how it really impacted on your work and what you can and can't do.
So I was back in March, which feels like a very long time ago now. I was actually quite happily working with an individual face to face. We were meeting up in the office, well, in the therapy room, and all of a sudden I received a phone call from my supervisor that went, "You're no longer allowed to do face-to-face. That's the rules that's just come from head office. You've now got to do telephone counselling," which was fine, having trained in telephone counselling but never actually used it for a while. You kind of had to remember how to, all the rules kind of thing. And so that was, and then it was less than 24 hours later, I was having to make my first counselling via telephone. And it was a challenge. I will say that going from face to face to suddenly having to talk to that person on the telephone, and especially knowing that person's habit as well, it was quite a challenge. And it raised a lot of, I think because we met face to face, the transition wasn't too bad, but in places I had to be mindful that we were in a therapy session and not a general conversation with a friend. So, but yeah, other than that, but then when after like using her as a learning curve, I would have said, the next person I took, we became quite, it was straight from the beginning, we used the telephone. So there was no like the initial meet or anything like that. It was just a straightforward telephone like counselling session, which after a while, I mean, how many months after, like 5 months of doing telephone counselling, I actually like it. I really enjoy it. So it's, yeah, I wouldn't say it takes away the face-to-face, but I enjoy it. Seem to get more from it.
So, I mean, there's obviously going to be a very different experience, I should imagine, from doing face-to-face counselling to doing telephone counselling. I should imagine they're quite different. For those that work supporting people, and not necessarily in a therapy way, but just generally supporting people, so doing well-being, welfare checks, even just to the point of ringing up family and chatting with family during this season. What can we learn from someone as yourself that is trained in telephone counselling, and what can we take away? So we're working on video or email, we're working in these different formats, but we're not actually able really to study body language, which is a lot of our conversation.
Yeah.
So what can we actually take away from that? What can we learn from therapy for those supporting people?
Well, it's the same technique as if you were face to face. However, naturally you can't read body language. But what you do tend to use is a bit like you rely on all your other senses. And after a while, you start to tune into that person's breathing and their tone of voice. And so you're using all the key active listening skills that you would have done face to face. But what you're doing is that you're actually listening more to what the person is saying and how they're saying. So you're kind of like tuning into those bits even more than what you would have done. Yes, you would have done, but if you think that off the top of my head, I think the statistic is that we only use 7% words and the rest of it's made up of body language and facial expressions. So when we think about how much we're now tuning into what that person's saying and the way that they're saying what they're talking about as well, does actually play a big part of what you do. And also sometimes it's just a case making that initial phone call is quite important for that person as well, is knowing that actually that there's someone there that is able to talk to them as well. I think when we talk about telephone counselling and things like that, one of the key things that comes up is silences. How do you work with silence? Because sitting in a counselling room opposite someone that is silent is quite tricky. But doing it when they're actually on the end of the telephone, because for you, you might think, oh, they're making the cup of tea, they put the phone on the side and walked off. It's just, for me, I think it's a case of you just sit there, you just like listen, and you get that instinct, you know, if that person has disengaged with what you're saying. So just by like reassuring them that you're still there, if they've been a while, what you feel like has been a while. But sometimes it's important to have them silences, because they've got to process what you've just said or what they have just said. Because for some people, this could be the first time they've spoken to anybody for a long time about what they've kept like within themselves. So take like the grief, for instance. They might have just come back from the doctor and they might have just turned around and said, you need to go and seek help. So this could be their first time of ever telling anyone that they've been carrying this grief around with them for many years, and it's now starting to come out. So just by sitting there talking to them, letting them know that they're okay is important, and letting them know that you're okay to listen to this as well, and that you won't judge them. And that's the other thing, is about not being judgmental and letting them know that they're not going to be judged, and just reassuring them that what they're going to tell you, you can handle as well. Because that's the other thing, that they start going, oh no, I can't tell you that. And it's important that they do, because that's usually the bit that they're hiding from themselves and from you. So I hope that helped.
I'm intrigued because you know, and I've heard this before, we're counselling this term actively listening. Yeah. And it's almost as if it's a different stage of listening, that we have a listening, and then we have this supercharged listening, which is active listening. And obviously audio devices, telephones, you get distortion. We've all sat in meetings where the internet's dropping out for one of the participants and you get this squeaky, horrible, or words are missed. I mean, how can we use active listening when we're not in a face-to-face situation?
By focusing yourself. So if you know that you're going to answer that telephone, by taking a deep breath and by completely focusing on that person. So what you do is, you can, like, to actively listen, you completely put all your focus onto that individual that is on that phone, and then you just blot out all the noises that are around you, and then that way you're giving them your sole focus, really. And that way that then will attune you to actively listen to what is being said.
So just wanting to expand.
That's fine.
So is it perhaps not so much about the listening, but about focusing on the conversation? I mean, is there something there? I mean, I know that when I'm working from home, it's very easy to get distracted. You've got things on your desk, you want to go and play with them, or there's a list of jobs you've got to do, or you look around and you think, oh, I haven't done the hoovering this morning, or whatever. So perhaps part of what we can learn from yourself about active listening is actually putting the time aside to focus on the video call we're making, or on the telephone call we're making, or even, does that work with an email? I mean, with that?
Yeah. When we come to do email counselling, we treat that as the same way as what we would do if it's face to face. So we use the same rules well, same guidelines that we would use in a face-to-face session, even by doing the email. So we're quite disciplined that to send that email, you have allocated yourself the hour that you would give to a client. Okay, it might not take you an hour to send that email, but in that hour, you've then put yourself into that zone where you've reread. So what we do with the emails is that, yes, we read them. We do the initial read the email, then we go across them again to reread the email to get out the key information. And then we answer the email as if we're talking to the person. So, and then that way we get the feeling that they're actually in the room, in the space, shall we say, because it's not necessarily the room, we just say the space, the therapy space. And then that way we can interact with them that way. And then to send the email, it's almost like you're still in that conversation with them. So when the email comes back, you've started the next part of the conversation, really. So it's just this backwards and forwards.
Sorry.
Right.
I'm really interested when you're saying there that the email was if we was talking to someone. So
Yeah.
perhaps you used a different form of language. Would you use, say, more colloquial than academic language when you're forming the email? Do you know for colloquial termism, slang? I don't know, maybe foul language. I don't know.
So basically, what happens is this is my personal take on it. When I'm working with clients, obviously I can't be too academic. I try to mirror the language that they use where possible, that is to say, or I try to do it in ways that helps them to work with what's being said. So it's quite a challenge sometimes, because like you want to use terminology that will sum up how they're feeling, like especially if you're using grief models. I could like quite easily go into quite academic mode, but then I'm thinking no, because they haven't got this information in front of them to process. So in a face-to-face climate, I could pull out my book that's got the pictures in, the picture diagrams. Whereas via the telephone, unless I've done that pre-initial email that I send them the resources, they would not have a clue on the Tompkin model, for instance, which is a set of what looks like three balls of various sizes. But trying to describe that over the telephone has been a challenge, but it's been worth it. But it's almost like you have to find a link between what you're saying and what they're understanding as well.
So almost as if you have to address it that they don't have any resources, they don't have any knowledge, they don't have any database they can tap into, that whatever you contain in the email must stand in its own right. There's no follow-up. I should imagine if you're in a therapy session, or I know that I've sat with people talking about various things, that you can clarify terms. You can go, oh no, actually that energy doesn't quite work, and I just go back and rephrase that.
Yeah.
I don't suppose you have that option with the email.
No, not with an email. No. The emails, you pretty much have to double check how you're saying things, because also the problem we've got with email is how we interpret them, because how I interpret them might be completely different to how you do. So we've got to make sure that what we say is like quite precise, but also doesn't, and also so it can't be implied any other way than how we're trying to say it as well. So yeah, that's why they are quite constructed in the way they are. There's ordinary emails naturally, and they can read like an ordinary email, but you have to think over what it is you're trying to convey to that person, so that it gives them the inspiration or the hope that you're giving them.
So I suppose as we approach lockdown 2, that actually there's a lesson here that we can learn even with things like WhatsApp or, Facebook, Twitter, social media full stop.
Yeah.
Is actually being aware of this interpretation, that the person receiving what we're saying might not interpret it the same way that we're saying it.
Yeah, definitely. Especially if they're experience a bereavement, well, especially if they experience a grief or loss, and that's any form of loss, whether it's the loss of job, loss of what the loss can be anything. They're going to be in a completely different place to where you are. So you might be sending them what could be interpreted. You might think it was a bit of a laugh or a joke statement, but they might not receive it as that. So it's also gauging whereabouts would that person be when I send this message. So it's working with the individual as well. So it's almost like you need to establish a kind of relationship first before. It's like any therapy or any support we do. The initial thing is to start that relationship in the therapeutic sense, and then you can build on what you've already established.
So just going what you was talking about there, you used two different terms. You used the term bereavement and you used the term grief.
Okay. Yeah.
Are these separate terms, or because I always understood that actually bereavement and grief were the same thing, but I'm guessing you used them in slightly different contexts.
Yeah.
Potentially slightly different terms.
Yeah. So a bereavement, the definition that we mainly use is a bereavement is the death of a loved one, whether that's a pet, it's someone that was close, someone that you loved, is what we use the bereavement, and that is like the death, and that's the death of a loved one. And grief is the reaction that you get. So when we say reaction, this could be physical, it could be behavioural, it could be emotional. It's that physical sensation you get from the grief itself. So yeah, you kind of use them. We tend to use grief when we're working, but bereavement when we're generalising. So that seems to be how I use them.
So during lockdown 1, there was a lot of talk about anticipatory grief.
Yeah.
And already I'm hearing conversations where these terms come up again, anticipatory grief. Yeah. From your professional experience, could you explain to us what anticipatory grief is?
Okay, so anticipatory grief is when we preparing ourselves for a loss of something. Now I say loss as in a general sense because we use anticipatory grief, we experience quite a lot throughout the day, whether we're aware of it or not. But when we're facing something of a big loss, say like end of life, and we have the information, then we prepare ourselves. We go through a state of anticipatory grief. Okay, what that means is that we then experience the key stages as if it was an ordinary grief. So for instance, you will feel the denial, you will feel anger, you will feel the bargaining, you will then feel the depression, and then you will feel the acceptance. So you work through each one of those stages. It's not a linear process. So the fact that you hear it or see it written in a linear form, it's not. You bounce through each stage until you've completed the task of that stage, and then you move on. So at the moment, in light of COVID, or the second lockdown, is people don't know at the moment. We're in sort of like, I would say we're very much still in the denial stage, and some people may be in the shock stage, not shock, the anger stage. because at the moment we just don't know what's going to happen in our future. What we haven't got that thing to plan for, because we don't know. And what our experience of last time, it's different for everybody. So what they experienced last time is going to be what they hold is going to happen to them this time. So you've got that element of them holding of the fear of going into this lockdown because of reminders of what happened previous.
So I'm just thinking there. So we obviously have a basis that we're approaching lockdown 2, which we have this experience of lockdown 1. Whether lockdown 2 will be the same, we don't know, but we have this basis. Now, we know that it was a very difficult period in lots of people's life, and is likely to be a very difficult period in lots of people's lives. Is there any tips or anything you can suggest to help us deal with this? Because I don't suppose we can just switch off from the anticipation of what's going to happen.
No.
You know, we certainly, or for myself personally, I can't just suddenly stop worrying about what the lockdown means to my family, to my friends, to my colleagues. So what can we use to help us deal with that anticipatory grief?
Self-care for you and self-care for others. So basically one thing that you can do is by voicing it to people, and whether that's those around you or other people that you can trust, that you can like reach out and actually turn around and say, look, I'm a bit worried about this at the moment. There's organisations, if you feel like you're stuck in one of those sections one of those like groups that I've already talked about, if you feel like you get stuck in one of those, definitely go and seek help from one of the organisations or your GP, or if you're in the university, obviously you've got the chaplaincy and you've got the welfare team. But just don't keep it to yourself. Just go and talk. Even sometimes it's not necessarily because you need to offload because you're tense or something. Sometimes it's because you just need a laugh, because you know there are times when we need a good laugh in order to release all the tension that's in us. So it's just like going to have self-care, going to find somebody to talk to is one of the best ways. And like self-care can be anything, that whether it's going for a walk, doing arts, craft, or whatever it is that will make you get to a better place in yourself.
So obviously, I mean, so the way you're talking about anticipatory grief, it doesn't sound like any of us can escape it. It sounds like something that we've all got to deal with, and for the next however long we live in this COVID season, these seasons of lockdown, that we have to carry this anticipatory grief with us. If we are in a position where we're helping others, how do we need to be aware of how that is affecting us when we're trying to support others? Okay,
so the first thing that you can do is do a self-check-in. And as therapists, this is what I do before a session and after a session, and maybe during a session. And that is to check in. It's basically to almost do a personal body scan, so that you know that you're feeling happy, you know that this is you personally, that you're in a good place, so that when you're talking to that person and they're getting really, really angry, you don't then take on their emotions. You can give them back their emotions to them, kind of thing, but basically they can project all their emotions onto you, but you're not actually going to hold them as such. You can sort of like get rid of them because you know you don't own them. And then that's the bit of therapy that obviously the therapist does, but it's knowing as well that have a vague idea of where that person is, and you can get that from the moment you start talking to them. And it's basically sometimes it's that initial, if they're angry or frustrated, they just need to offload that. And sometimes just being the strong person to just sit there and to be able to be screamed at, shouted at, while they're releasing this anger or releasing the frustration. And then afterwards they might go, most of the time they actually apologize for feeling like that, and then they become embarrassed because they've let all of this out and they don't know what to do with themselves because they might have been carrying this around for quite some time. So
in counselling terms, is this what they talk about, isn't it? Projection and transference, is that the correct terms?
Yeah.
So I'm guessing projection is allowing someone to express their anger in a safe environment, and transference is when you actually take that on. So thinking about anticipatory grief and thinking about the 5 terms you use: denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance. We have to be very aware of where we are in those 5, I don't know, areas, bubbles, whatever they are. We have to be aware of where we are, because that is what protects us from the transference. Then taking that on. And is there a genuine danger that you can end up taking someone else's emotion on and changing how you're experiencing the world?
There you can end up, if you're not, if you've accidentally, I say accidentally, if you suddenly end up taking on their emotion. And the way sometimes it happens is if you're in you feel quite happy, pumped up, excited about something, and then you're talking to someone that's quite depressed, and then afterwards you suddenly feel a bit depressed yourself. That means that you've taken on their emotion, and what you need to do then is you need to get rid of that yourself, whether that's definitely go and talk to someone else who you can offload this to, and it's by offloading it and to work out why that person affected you in that way at that particular moment is a lot of the key to how therapists get through some of the tough traumatic things that they that they hear in therapy.
So I guess what you're saying, that as helping individuals or helping professionals, that we also need to be aware that we need to offload as well, that we can't carry this around, that we need to find someone that we can offload this to. So I'm going to put you on the spot, because I like putting people on the spot. So I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to say to you, how do you think that lockdown 2 will be different from lockdown 1?
Oh, crumbs. Personally, now this is my personal opinion, so I really don't want to influence anybody. I think it's going to be harder. I know from my own personal experience that it's going to be tougher, and we're going to be calling on so much inner strength just to get through this. Not only we're trying to get through it ourselves, but if we're also in the helping profession as well, we've got other people that we need our energies just as well as much as we do. I know that Cruse, as the organisation, has put a lot of preparation in for a second lockdown, and they're sort of like having all kinds of like behind the scenes kind of things happening in order to prepare for this. But for me, what struck me a few days ago was looking at the figures and the prediction of figures. And as a bereavement counsellor, I suddenly looked at those figures and I thought, crumbs, for every person, there's a whole family. And then I suddenly really thought about a bullseye. I had an image of a bullseye. And I suddenly thought, if you think about, like, every person has a family, then they know friends, and then all standing inside that bullseye. And then when you think that because of how society, we all know, so, you know, that's that thing of so many people removed, and then you know somebody else, how close these bullseyes will be soon overlapping. I mean, that struck me as something of, crumbs, there's going to be people out there that is going to experience so many bereavements, whether that's their direct relative, close friends, work colleague, or somebody. The knock-on effect that that is going to hold, if just by looking at these figures, is just, well, that's what I got out of looking at these figures, that are just astounding, really.
So I suppose that, in a way, going back to this anticipatory grief,
Yeah.
but in actual fact that could be higher for people going into this lockdown than the last lockdown. I suppose, in a way, the last lockdown was into the sense of the unknown. There was almost a sense of excitement, challenge behind it. I get those are the wrong words, but there almost was this, like, this is new, this is untried territory, we can try all sorts of different things.
Yeah.
Whereas this time, a lot of that isn't there. A lot this time, it's a lot harder. It's winter, the evenings are darker, it's colder.
Yeah.
And we're just physically and mentally more tired. I mean, we've been going through this horrendous season that we're living in since March. Everyone is physically tired, everyone is mentally tired.
Yeah.
And yet here we go again, we're almost having to up our game again. And I suppose we need to be very aware of that.
Yeah, and also one of the other things that is going to be what was very noticeable in the last lockdown, and that's the loneliness. Loneliness is the one of the hardest parts to deal with, really, and that seems to be what people that have come to Cruse has been the bit that they really struggled with, was the loneliness, because it actually, being on your own actually makes everything, magnifies everything. So even the slightest thing that normally you could, like, manage yourself and you could do an everyday task, all of a sudden becomes so big and so overwhelming that that's usually, and just thinking about going into this time, you're carrying all of that with you. So it's just like support. Yeah.
So just before we open up for questions, could you just, is that still anticipatory grief, this carrying with you, is that still anticipatory grief, or is that something else?
I would,
not the anticipatory grief process?
I would say it's part of the anticipatory grief as well. The loneliness is part of the grief, is a grief reaction anyway. It is part of the process that you go, well, when you go experience grief, you do actually experience lonely. There is a period, whether that's only an hour, whether that's something, but there's a tiny period of loneliness there. And it depends on who it is that's died. So, and depending on your relationship, it will depend on how you are as well on that side.
Lots to think about and lots to contemplate and be aware of, I think, over the next few weeks. Let's open up to questions. Has anyone got any questions or any observations that they'd like to bring forward?
I can ask a question.
Okay.
Jane, can you reflect a bit on the importance of anniversaries, the anniversary of death, and what happens to people as they approach those and how to mark them. They seem to be very important moments in the grief process.
Yeah, and especially at the moment, because we're in the moment of remembrance, aren't we? We've had the week of remembrance or so. So basically, it's usually what I tend to do is turn around and say to the people, the individual, is ask them how they're going to mark the anniversary. What special thing are they going to do? During lockdown, we had that period where no one could go to the graveside. So how do you mark that occasion? So some of the suggestions that I turned around and said was to do the thing to mark it with a candle or a special plant, if you can't go to the graveside, that is. But it's usually we tend to find that people get themselves worked up and usually find it most stressful leading up to the anniversary. And the same with Christmas, same with Mother's Day, Father's Day, any of the big celebrations. It's usually the leading up to that becomes more distressful for people than the actual day. And any of these occasions, like we turn around and say, like Christmas is one of those classics. And we turn around and said, like, it's okay to have the family around. It's great to celebrate and to be happy, and you're okay for doing that. But if you suddenly feel that you want to take yourself off, tell everybody that you want to take yourself off for a moment. And then if you want to cry, cry. If you want to scream, scream. But whatever it is that comes over you, go away and do it, and then return, and you will be fine that you can still enjoy the day and still have that memory as well. And also it's nice to actually have family interaction on that day as well, for some people that can. So they might want to be with the people that were there, just to talk through to discuss memories of the person, or actually talk about the day, if it was the funeral or something like that, or some memorial or something. It's just like being able to acknowledge that person was part of their family, or part of their life, even if it wasn't necessarily their family.
AJ?
Thank you for coming to chat, Jane. I really appreciated the differentiation between bereavement and grief. That actually bereavement would tend to be more over a death, whereas grief could be kind of whatever emotion or physical response to anything. But yeah, so regarding my question is, you spoke about checking in, like a self check-in before emailing or phone calls. How does your faith come into this? Do you pray before
Okay, so I never really admitted this before, so this is a first. So basically, I actually like ritual.
Okay.
I'm one of these people. I really love rituals. So in church, when the rituals are going on, I'm engrossed in what's happening. And so for me, I've kind of brought that into the counselling room, because prior to the client arriving, I will go in, I will set the room out in a specific way that's for me. And when we were in the office, when we was in the therapy room, we had this candle, and it had people, it looked like figures, like the cut out paper figures that hold hands. Yeah, it was one of those, but it was in a candle holder, and I always had that positioned in a certain place that I can always see it. we didn't light them because in the room you wasn't allowed candles to be lit, but they could be there. So that had to be there, and it had to be in a specific place. And I would always sort of like go in, set the room out, make sure it's all like that. Then obviously do the session with the client, and the whole time that I was there with you'll be with the client, and this is also with the phone as well. Time just suddenly goes very quickly. It's one of those that what feels like a minute suddenly is an hour. So it's one of those. And then afterwards, once the client goes, I go back into the room, I sit down, I do my notes, and then I suddenly, one of the things that was said in therapy was that you wear a cloak. You put on a cloak to do therapy, and then when you come out the room, you take your cloak off, you shut the door, and then you're fine, and then you'll return back to you. And that to me is my ritual of what I do. But how do I know that where there's God? That's the bit, because Ruth said that you just don't know where God is till it's afterwards. And there are many a times when leaving the therapy room, walking along the road, that I suddenly go, okay, I feel good. That was obviously where it is. Or I might be a few days later and I suddenly get a reminder of what actually happened in that session. But yeah, it's one of those that it's there, but I just don't actually know. I don't personally know that it's happening until afterwards. So.
Thanks.
Yeah, another question is it's like an obvious point, but why does it help to talk? Because sometimes you can rehearse to somebody else exactly the same thoughts you've had in your own head.
Yeah.
But somehow getting them out makes a big difference. I mean, I know that for myself, but why? Why does talking work?
The only thing that I can think about, this probably sounds very Freudian, is basically you're making your thoughts, you basically, as you say them out loud, you become conscious of them. So because you're talking out in you're speaking out, your conscious mind is then processing what you have heard. And sometimes by hearing what you say to somebody, you actually interpret and go, oh, actually, I didn't mean to say that like that. That's not how I was thinking it. What? And then that way you can understand why you're thinking that way, and to explore it that way, if that makes any sense to you. So it's about bringing it into your conscious to process it. So.
Is anyone anything else? No. So I thank you for being with us, Jane. I thank you for giving up a tremendous amount of your knowledge. There's a lot there to take and ponder, especially as we move into this new lockdown in a few days' time. Yeah, I think there's a lot to take there. So thank you very much for being with us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us for God Talk, and please join us for another episode when we will look at what it means to have a lived faith.